The rain would not stop. For weeks it fell across the fields of England, France, and the Low Countries, turning the rich brown soil into something closer to a swamp than farmland. In villages from Yorkshire to Flanders, men stood at the edges of their fields, watching water pool where wheat should have been rising green and strong. They did not yet know it, but they were watching the beginning of the end of a world. Within months, the price of grain would rise beyond anything living memory could recall. Within a year, mothers would be forced to choose which of their children to feed. Within 2 years, in some desperate corners of Europe, the dead would not be safe from the living. This is the story of the Great Famine of 1315. A catastrophe so vast it would kill an estimated 10 to 15% of the population of Northern Europe, unravel the confidence of kings, and quietly plant the seeds for a plague that would follow a generation later. It is a story almost forgotten today, overshadowed by the Black Death that came after it. But before there was plague, there was hunger. And before there was hunger, there was a world that believed, wrongly, that it had conquered nature itself. To understand what was lost, one must first understand what Europe had built in the 2 centuries before the rains came. The period historians now call the medieval warm period had blessed the continent with a run of extraordinarily favorable climate conditions, stretching roughly from the year 900 to the early 1300s. Summers were long and mild. Winters, while cold, were rarely catastrophic. Glaciers in the Alps retreated. Vineyards flourished as far north as England, a detail that seems almost impossible to modern eyes accustomed to a colder, wetter British climate. Grain grew reliably. Harvests, year after year, filled granaries with a consistency that allowed something remarkable to happen. The population of Europe nearly tripled. Villages grew into towns. Towns grew into cities. Forests were cleared at a staggering pace to make way for new farmland, as lords and peasants alike raced to feed the swelling number of mouths. By the early 14th century, England alone may have held between 5 and 6 million people, a number it would not see again until centuries later. Paris had grown into one of the largest cities in the Western world. London's streets, though narrow and filthy by modern standards, pulsed with the energy of a rapidly expanding merchant economy. This was not a golden age in any simple sense. Life for the average peasant remained brutally hard, defined by back-breaking labor, high infant mortality, and a rigid feudal hierarchy that offered little mercy to those born without land or title. But there was, crucially, food. Usually enough of it, most years, to survive on. Bread was the foundation of the medieval diet, accounting for as much as 70 or 80% of the calories consumed by an ordinary family. A loaf of bread was not simply a meal, it was survival itself, measured out daily in a way that modern people, surrounded by abundance, can scarcely imagine. Around this foundation of bread, medieval society had built an entire civilization. Manor houses collected rents in grain. Monasteries stored surplus in vast stone granaries, some of which still stand today as monuments to an age that believed, with a kind of quiet confidence, that the harvest would always come. But this confidence rested on something fragile, a system of agriculture that had almost no margin for error. Medieval farming, for all its ingenuity, produced yields that would horrify a modern agronomist. A single seed of wheat, planted and tended through an entire growing season, might yield only 3 or 4 seeds in return, compared to the 20, 30, or even 50-fold yields that modern industrial agriculture can achieve. This meant that farmers had to set aside a significant portion of each harvest simply to have seed for the following year, leaving a perilously thin surplus to actually feed the population. There was no refrigeration, no rail network to move surplus grain from a bountiful region to a starving one, no scientific understanding of crop rotation beyond the traditional 3-field system that had been refined through trial and painful error over generations. Storage itself was a gamble. Grain kept in damp conditions rotted or sprouted mold, and rural communities operating on the edge of subsistence in a good year had virtually nothing held in reserve for a bad one. When the harvest failed, as it occasionally did, communities absorbed the blow through communal resilience, borrowed grain, and simple endurance. What no one had prepared for, what no one could have prepared for, was for the harvest to fail not once, but again and again and again. The climate itself was beginning to turn, though almost no one alive at the time could have understood why. Modern climatologists, studying tree rings, ice cores, and glacial records, have identified the early 14th century as the beginning of a profound shift. The end of the medieval warm period and the slow, uneven onset of what would later be called the Little Ice Age. The precise triggers remain a subject of ongoing scientific study, with researchers pointing to changes in solar activity, shifts in North Atlantic Ocean circulation, and volcanic activity that may have pumped ash and sulfur into the atmosphere, cooling global temperatures. Whatever the cause, the effect on Northern Europe's weather patterns in the years leading up to 1315 was unmistakable. The jet stream shifted, and with it came a relentless, almost biblical pattern of rain. It began in the spring of 1315. Chroniclers across England, France, Germany, and the Low Countries recorded, independently and consistently, weather unlike anything in living memory. The rains came in April and did not truly relent until harvest time, and even then, only partially. Fields that should have been drying under the early summer sun instead sat waterlogged, the young wheat and barley shoots rotting at the root or simply failing to sprout at all. Hay, essential for feeding livestock through the coming winter, could not be properly cut and dried. It rotted in the fields, turning brown and useless under skies that seemed to offer no mercy. In low-lying regions, rivers burst their banks entirely, drowning fields that had fed families for generations. A chronicler in England described roads turned to impassable mud, carts sinking to their axles, bridges swept away by swollen rivers. In the Low Countries, some of the most agriculturally advanced and densely populated territory in Europe, the flooding was particularly devastating, striking a region that depended heavily on imported grain, even in good years, and now found both its own fields ruined and its supply lines disrupted. By the autumn of 1315, the harvest came in, and it was catastrophic. Estimates suggest yields across large parts of northern Europe fell by as much as half, and in the worst affected areas, considerably more. For a population living, as most did, on the thinnest of margins, this was not a hardship to be endured. It was an existential threat. Grain prices, which in a stable year might fluctuate modestly with supply and demand, began to climb at a pace that stunned contemporaries. In England, wheat prices are recorded as rising to nearly 4 times their normal level within the space of a single year. In parts of France and the Low Countries, the increases were even steeper. For the wealthy, this meant inconvenience and higher costs. For the poor, the vast majority of the population, it meant the beginning of a slow, grinding descent into starvation, because a family that had once spent half its meager income on bread now found that same amount of money buying only a fraction of what it once had. What makes the unfolding disaster of 1315 so difficult to comprehend, even now, is that it did not happen in isolation, and it did not happen quickly. This was not a single terrible harvest followed by recovery. The rains returned in 1316, just as merciless, just as sustained. And they returned again in diminished but still damaging form in 1317. 3 consecutive years of agricultural failure struck a continent that had never built the infrastructure, the surplus, or the institutional capacity to survive even one such year, let alone 3. Contemporary chroniclers, writing in Latin in monasteries across England and the continent, struggled to find language adequate to what they were witnessing. One English source described the price of oxen, sheep, and pigs collapsing as desperate farmers, unable to feed their animals through winters when even hay was scarce, slaughtered and sold them in numbers that flooded the market. A short-term glut of meat that masked a longer-term catastrophe, because livestock, once slaughtered in panic, could not be used to plough fields or produce milk and offspring in the years that followed. The very animals that should have provided a buffer against famine were instead consumed as a symptom of it, deepening the crisis for years to come. In the towns and cities, where populations had grown dependent on grain shipped in from the surrounding countryside, the crisis took on its own particular horror. Urban authorities in cities across Flanders, France, and England attempted various measures to control the unfolding disaster, fixing grain prices, in some cases with severe penalties for hoarding or profiteering, and in others attempting to organize charitable distribution of what food remained. But these measures, however well-intentioned, could not create grain that did not exist. Price controls, in particular, often backfired, as merchants simply refused to bring what little grain they had into markets where they were forbidden from selling it at a price that reflected its genuine scarcity, driving trade underground and making the crisis, paradoxically, worse in the very cities attempting to manage it. It was in this period that England's King Edward II, still a young and politically embattled monarch, found himself confronted with a crisis that no amount of royal authority could resolve through decree alone. Records suggest that even the royal household struggled to secure adequate provisions during a visit to St Albans in August 1315, a detail that reveals just how deeply and universally the scarcity had penetrated. When even the table of a king could not be reliably supplied, the situation facing ordinary families can scarcely be imagined. And it is in the ordinary families, the ones who left no chronicles, no royal accounts, no monastery records bearing their names, that the true weight of this catastrophe must be measured. Historians estimate that the Great Famine killed somewhere between 10 and 15% of the population across the worst affected regions of Northern Europe, a death toll in the millions, though precise figures remain elusive given the limitations of medieval record-keeping. Behind every percentage point were individual, unrecorded tragedies. A father in a Flemish village walking miles to a neighbouring parish in search of grain that did not exist there either. A mother in rural England watching her children grow gaunt and listless as the winter of 1315 into 1316 dragged on, with no relief in sight, no reserve to draw upon, no understanding of when or whether the rains would finally stop. What made the suffering of these anonymous families so much worse was not simply the weather. Nature had delivered the blow, but human systems, political, economic, and social, determined how deeply that blow would cut and who would be left standing when it passed. The feudal structure that governed most of Northern Europe in 1315 had never been designed with resilience in mind. It was a system built to extract, not to store. Lords collected rents and dues from their peasants in fixed amounts, regardless of whether the harvest had been abundant or catastrophic, because the obligations of the manorial system were rarely adjusted for circumstance. A peasant family that owed a certain measure of grain to their lord in a good year owed that same measure in a year when their own children were going hungry. Some lords, to their credit, did show flexibility and mercy during the worst months of the crisis, reducing or forgiving dues they knew could not possibly be paid. But many did not, either from necessity. Their own households depended on those rents to survive, or from a rigid adherence to custom that left no room for compassion when compassion was most needed. The result was a system that, in its ordinary functioning, siphoned grain away from the very people who had grown it, and toward the manor houses, monasteries, and market towns where it might be sold, stored, or simply consumed by those with the power to claim it first. War compounded the disaster in ways that are often overlooked in accounts that focus purely on weather and harvests. In 1315, much of Northern Europe was not at peace. King Edward II of England was engaged in a costly and ultimately disastrous military campaign against Scotland, a conflict that would culminate in humiliating defeats and that continued to drain resources, manpower, and grain supplies away from a population already reeling from agricultural collapse. Armies, wherever they marched, requisitioned food from the countryside they passed through, a practice that had always imposed hardship on rural communities, but which, in a year of genuine scarcity, could tip a struggling village from hardship into outright starvation. The complex web of trade routes that ordinarily allowed surplus grain from one region to flow toward a shortage in another was also disrupted by the political rivalries and periodic conflicts that fractured medieval Europe into competing, often mutually suspicious territories. Flanders, in particular, found itself caught in ongoing political tension with the French crown during this exact period. Tension that complicated the movement of grain and goods precisely when unimpeded trade might have saved lives. There was also a failure of understanding that, while impossible to hold against people living 7 centuries ago, is heartbreaking to consider from a modern vantage point. Medieval authorities and clergy, confronted with a disaster of this scale, overwhelmingly interpreted it through a religious and moral lens rather than a practical or agricultural one. Chroniclers and preachers spoke of the famine as divine punishment, a chastisement sent by God for the sins of a wayward people. Processions, fasting, and prayer were organized in cities and towns across the afflicted regions, sincere and often desperate attempts to appease what was understood to be righteous divine anger. This is not to mock the faith of people living through incomprehensible suffering. For a medieval mind, steeped in a worldview where God's hand shaped every earthly event, this explanation was the most rational one available. But it also meant that the response to the crisis, at the level of ideas and public discourse, focused heavily on spiritual repentance rather than the kind of practical measures. Grain storage reform, trade coordination, agricultural innovation, that might have built resilience against the next such disaster. There simply was no framework in 1315 for understanding that a shift in Atlantic weather patterns, utterly indifferent to human virtue or sin, could be the true author of their suffering. Beneath these large historical forces, the famine's true character reveals itself only in the smaller, human-scale stories that survive in fragments across the chronicles of the time. In the countryside surrounding Ypres, in Flanders, a region that would come to be remembered as one of the hardest hit in all of Europe. Burial records from the years 1315 to 1317 show a staggering spike in mortality, with some historians estimating that as much as 10% of the city's population may have died in the famine's worst year alone. Ypres was, at the time, one of the great cloth manufacturing centers of medieval Europe, a wealthy and sophisticated city by the standards of the age. Yet its wealth could not manufacture grain from flooded fields, and its sophistication offered no defense against a crisis that struck rich and poor alike, though never equally. The poor, as always, died first and died in far greater numbers, while those with money could still, in the famine's early stages, purchase whatever grain remained at whatever price it commanded. It is in Flanders, too, that some of the most harrowing accounts of the famine's final horrors emerge. Contemporary chroniclers, writing with evident distress, recorded instances of parents abandoning children they could no longer feed and, in the most extreme and desperate corners of the crisis, accounts impossible to verify with certainty, but recorded by multiple independent sources of the period, of the starving resorting to consuming the flesh of the dead, including, in the most horrifying reports, newly buried corpses exhumed from graveyards, and even, according to a small number of chronicle accounts describing the very worst affected areas, instances of parents unable to save their own children from death by starvation. Historians today treat these specific accounts with appropriate caution, aware that medieval chroniclers sometimes exaggerated for moral or rhetorical effect, and that such reports may reflect rumor and fear as much as documented fact. But the very existence of these rumors, spreading and being recorded as plausible across multiple regions and multiple independent writers, speaks to a level of social breakdown and desperation that is almost impossible for a modern audience, accustomed to supermarket shelves and global food distribution, to genuinely absorb. Whether or not every specific account was literally true, the world that produced them, a world where such things could be believed, could be whispered about as happening in the next village or the next county, was a world that had come apart at its most basic seams. Disease followed hunger, as it always does. Malnutrition does not simply cause death by starvation in a clean, direct line. It devastates the immune system, leaving weakened bodies vulnerable to infections and illnesses that a well-fed population might have survived. Dysentery, pneumonia, and various fevers swept through communities already staggering under the weight of hunger, and the very young and the very old, as is tragically consistent across every famine in human history, died in the greatest numbers. Infant mortality, already high in the medieval period even in good years, appears to have spiked dramatically during the famine years, though the precise scale is difficult to establish given the limitations of parish and manorial records from this era, many of which recorded deaths of adult tenants and taxpayers far more reliably than they recorded the deaths of infants and small children who left no property, no debts, and no formal record of their brief lives. The social fabric of rural communities, which had for generations relied on networks of mutual obligation and neighborly support to weather bad years, began to fray under the sustained pressure of repeated failure. Petty theft of grain and livestock, rare in ordinary times within tightly knit village communities where reputation and trust governed daily life, increased noticeably according to court records from the period as desperate individuals crossed lines they never would have crossed in a normal year. Court records from various English manors in this period show a marked rise in prosecutions for theft of food and livestock, a small but telling window into how thoroughly the crisis eroded the ordinary rules of village life. There are also records suggesting that some regions saw an increase in what chroniclers described as banditry along roads, as displaced and starving individuals, having exhausted every legitimate avenue of survival, turned to robbery of travelers and merchants who might be carrying food. And yet, even amid this collapse, there are recorded moments of extraordinary mutual aid that deserve to be remembered alongside the horror. Monasteries across England and the continent, many of which maintained grain reserves precisely for the purpose of charitable distribution in times of hardship, opened their stores to feed the starving poor, even as their own resources dwindled toward exhaustion. Some urban governments organized public kitchens or subsidized grain distributions, straining civic finances to the breaking point in an effort to keep their populations alive. Individual acts of generosity. A family sharing their last stores of grain with starving neighbors, a landlord forgiving rents he desperately needed himself, went almost entirely unrecorded by the chroniclers of the age, who tended to focus their attention on kings, wars, and disasters rather than on quiet acts of ordinary decency. But such acts must have happened countless times, in countless villages, carried out by people whose names history will never know, and it is worth pausing, amid an account so heavy with horror, to remember that even in humanity's darkest famines, kindness did not entirely disappear. It simply became a matter of life and death in a way that peacetime charity never is. By 1317, the rains that had drowned 3 consecutive harvests finally began to relent, though relent is perhaps too gentle a word for a recovery that unfolded with agonizing slowness. The weather itself grew more favorable, but the famine's damage could not be undone simply because the skies had cleared. The population of Northern Europe had been catastrophically weakened, and it would take years, by some estimates, most of a decade, for agricultural production to return to pre-1315 levels. The livestock slaughtered in panic during the worst years could not be instantly replaced. Herds take years to rebuild, and the shortage of draft animals meant that even fields capable of producing a good harvest could not always be adequately plowed and worked. Seed grain, which desperate families had in some cases been forced to eat rather than plant, had to be painstakingly reacquired, often at ruinous cost, before the most basic cycle of agriculture could resume its normal rhythm. Villages that had lost a significant portion of their population found themselves short of the labor needed to work the fields that remained, creating a strange and cruel paradox in which land sat fallow, not for lack of soil or seed, but for lack of hands to till it. The recovery, where it came, was profoundly uneven. In parts of rural England, manorial records from the early 1320s show communities still struggling to restore the rent and tenancy arrangements that had governed them before 1315, with some holdings left vacant for years because no tenant could be found willing or able to take on land whose previous occupants had died or fled in search of food elsewhere. In Flanders, the great cloth towns that had suffered such devastating mortality took even longer to recover their commercial vitality, since a workforce decimated by starvation could not simply be replenished by decree, and the intricate networks of trade and craft that had made cities like Ypres and Ghent so prosperous depended on a density of skilled labor that famine had brutally thinned. In France, chroniclers writing in the 1320s still described widespread poverty and dislocation, with beggars filling the roads between towns in numbers that suggested a rural economy still struggling to absorb the shock of the preceding decade. Recovery, in other words, was not a single moment when the famine ended and normal life resumed. It was a long, uneven, often painful process, stretching across the better part of a generation, during which the memory of hunger remained close enough to touch. The famine's true significance, however, extends far beyond the immediate years of 1315 to 1317, and it is here that its story connects to something far larger and more terrible that would follow a generation later. The Great Famine did not cause the Black Death, which arrived on European shores in 1347, carried by a bacterium unrelated to the failures of weather and harvest that had struck 3 decades earlier. But the famine left behind a population that was, in ways both physical and social, profoundly vulnerable to whatever crisis might come next. Some historians argue that the generation born into or shaped by the famine years carried lasting effects of childhood malnutrition, potentially weakening the broader population's resilience in ways that made the catastrophic mortality of the Black Death, when it arrived, even more devastating than it might otherwise have been. Beyond the biological question, the famine had already begun to strain the feudal economic system to its breaking point, exposing the fragility of an agricultural model with no meaningful reserve capacity and revealing to peasants across Europe, in a way that would echo for generations, that the obligations of feudalism did not bend, even when survival itself was at stake. This slow-burning erosion of trust in the old order, scholars have suggested, may have quietly contributed to the social and economic upheavals that followed the Black Death, when a decimated peasant class, suddenly possessing far greater bargaining power in a labor-scarce world, began to challenge the rigid hierarchies that had governed their parents' and grandparents' lives. The peasant uprisings that would erupt in France and England later in the 14th century, most famously the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, drew on grievances that had been accumulating for decades. And among the oldest of those grievances was the bitter memory of a system that had demanded unwavering obedience, even while offering nothing in return during the worst years anyone could remember. There is also a quieter, more institutional legacy worth considering. In the decades following the famine, several English and continental towns began experimenting in modest and inconsistent ways with municipal grain storage schemes designed to build a buffer against future shortages. An early, imperfect recognition that a city dependent entirely on the immediate harvest of its surrounding countryside was a city perpetually one bad season away from catastrophe. These efforts were far from systematic, and they would not mature into anything resembling reliable famine prevention for centuries. But the instinct behind them, the idea that a community owed its most vulnerable members some measure of protection against the whims of weather, represented a small, hard-won lesson purchased at the cost of millions of lives. It is a lesson that modern societies, insulated by refrigeration, global trade, and scientific agriculture, rarely have cause to think about, but one that medieval Europe learned only because it had no choice. What strikes anyone who studies the Great Famine of 1315 today is how thoroughly it has been overshadowed by the catastrophe that followed it. The Black Death killed more people, arrived with a horror that gripped the medieval imagination in a way that a slow agricultural collapse never could, and left behind a wealth of vivid, harrowing accounts that have echoed through art, literature, and popular memory for 7 centuries. The famine, by contrast, unfolded gradually, without the visible drama of buboes and sudden death, and its victims died not in a single dramatic wave, but across 3 grinding years of diminishing harvests, rising prices, and slow physical decline. There is no single image, no single moment that captures the Great Famine the way a plague doctor's mask or a mass grave captures the Black Death in the popular imagination. Its horror was quieter, more diffuse, and in some ways more universal, because unlike plague, which struck with a kind of terrible randomness, hunger touched nearly everyone in the affected regions to some degree, distinguishing itself only in whether a family had enough resources to survive it or not. Perhaps this is why the Great Famine deserves to be remembered on its own terms, not merely as a grim prologue to the plague that followed. It was, in its own right, one of the most significant demographic catastrophes in medieval European history, a disaster that reshaped the lives of millions of people whose names we will never know and whose suffering left barely a trace in the historical record beyond the aggregate statistics that modern historians have painstakingly reconstructed from manorial accounts, parish registers, and monastic chronicles. It offers, too, a sobering lesson that feels strangely relevant even across the distance of 7 centuries. That a civilization can build itself, generation upon generation, on the quiet assumption that tomorrow will resemble today, and that even the most sophisticated societies remain, in the end, at the mercy of forces. A shift in ocean currents, a change in atmospheric patterns, 3 consecutive years of relentless rain, entirely beyond their understanding or control. The people of early 14th century Europe had built cathedrals that still stand, trade networks that spanned the continent, and cities of genuine wealth and sophistication. None of it had prepared them for what happened when the rain simply would not stop. And yet, for all its horror, the famine did not extinguish the civilization it struck. The fields were replanted. The granaries, empty for so many terrible seasons, were filled again. Children born in the years immediately following the crisis grew up in villages still marked by absence. Empty cottages, untended graves, families reduced by 1 or 2 or 3 members who simply were not there anymore. But they grew up, and in growing up, they carried forward a world that had come astonishingly close to a kind of collapse few of us, looking back from an age of supermarkets and refrigerated trucks, can truly picture. That continuity, fragile and hard-won as it was, is itself part of the story. Not everything was lost, even though so much was. Somewhere in the archives of a small parish in Flanders, or in the fading ink of a manorial account book in rural England, there are still lines recording the deaths of 1316 and 1317. Names, sometimes, or simply numbers, tallied by a clerk whose own hand may have trembled with hunger as he wrote. No monument marks these deaths. No single date is remembered the way we remember the arrival of plague ships in a harbour. There is only the quiet, cumulative weight of millions of ordinary lives, extinguished not by violence or disease alone, but by rain that fell for too long on a world that had never imagined it needed to prepare for a sky that would not clear. It is worth remembering them still, not as statistics in a historian's estimate, but as fathers who walked miles for grain that did not exist, as mothers who watched their children grow thin through winters with no end in sight, and as an entire generation that learned, in the harshest way imaginable, just how thin the line has always been between a world of abundance and a world of hunger.